Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. This week, shutting down the southern border, cutting aid to Central America, and Customs and Border Protection on the brink. Before we get started, please remember you can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you leave a review, it'll help more people find our show. You can also stream This Week in Immigration on our website at bipartisanpolicy.org/podcast. And as always, check out bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration for more information on the stories we discuss here on the show. And here with me today are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hey, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Immigration Policy Analyst. He's on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hi, Cris.
Hey, Jordan. How you doing?
Good. So President Trump has been threatening for a couple of weeks now to shut down the U.S. Mexico border in response to the increasing flow of migrants arriving there from Central America. And now several news reports indicate government agencies are seriously looking at how to operationalize those plans. Now, Trump has said that the threat is designed to pressure Congress to reform immigration laws and to push Mexico to clamp down on migrants crossing its own borders. But concerns are growing about the economic impact of such a move and whether it can even be carried out. Theresa, let's start right there. What would a border shutdown look like, and how could it be carried out?
Well, what we believe the president is talking about is shutting down the ports of entry. That is the places where legal commerce and traffic come into the country, are inspected and admitted. The U.S. Mexico border handles over $1.5 billion worth of goods and services to travelers a day. So it's a big economic driver for the United States. And even a moderate slowdown can have a major economic impact on the industry sectors that rely on that port of entry for entry. So, for example, the ports of entry that deal with a lot of fresh produce that we import from Mexico and South America. Closing down or slowing down that port of entry would have an impact across the United States. But it's also true that he can't, if he could shut down between the ports of entry, he would have done so. And between the ports of entry where most of the migrants are coming. So we think that, the biggest lever is an economic lever with Mexico and the United States, but it's if you will, a two-edged sword. Yes, it would hurt Mexico if we stopped flow of legitimate trade through the ports from Mexico and vice versa. It would also hurt the United States. So it would weigh heavily on both sides.
Yeah, so let's expand a little bit on those economic impacts. Trade with Mexico has obviously been a major topic over the last 2 years, both for separate reasons and for reasons related to immigration. How specifically would that border shutdown affect trade between the United States and Mexico, and who would be affected by that?
Sure. So if we're talking about what comes into the United States through the U.S. Mexico port of entry, daily you have thousands of workers who live on the Mexican side but have permission to work in the United States who cross that border to work. You have tourists and visitors who come in to spend their money in the United States, predominantly in a lot of those border communities, but also traveling to other parts of the United States. And then you have trade. Everything from car parts that are manufactured in facilities in Mexico and inserted into assembly lines and plants in Michigan, Indiana, and Ohio, to, as I mentioned, a lot of agriculture products are imported. A lot of finished consumer goods also come via Mexico. So a lot of industries are going to be impacted and could be impacted fairly quickly if we stop importing trade. If we're also talking about decreasing exports or closing down exports out of the ports of entry, that would have an impact on Mexico, but also the exporters in the United States who sell those goods into Mexico.
Yeah, we've been, at least, you've seen a lot of news reports that the United States will run out or have a shortage of avocados within 3 weeks. You would have auto plants in Detroit shutting down because of the parts not being able to arrive. So I think that this is one of the situations where the economic impact would become manifest very quickly. And I think that that's one of the things to consider, is that this isn't one of those things where, like, say, with a tariff, a tariff, you would see those effects kind of accumulate over time. I think this is because you're directly impacting the capacity of goods to be entering the United States. that will have an immediate impact more so than any tariff or any other way of sort of slowing down trade between the United States and Mexico.
Yeah, it's all about supply chains. And since the North American Free Trade Agreement, our supply chains between the United States, Canada, and Mexico have shrunk. So that most facilities in the United States don't keep a lot of inventory on hand because they know they can get it pretty rapidly across the border. That would change. People might start stockpiling inventory, which is a cost to the economy. But then you'd also see shortages. So again, this is a big economic lever. One of the other things I would point out, though, separate from what the president has been tweeting about shutting down the border, we're already seeing impacts at the border. So CBP on its own as an operational initiative has been diverting officers from the port of entry to go assist Border Patrol in certain sectors to help with the influx of migrants. This has been happening in El Paso. The port of Nogales, Arizona closed down some Sunday hours for truck processing so that port of entry officials could help Border Patrol. We're seeing it in other parts of the border as well. So there's already operationally some slowdowns happening, and we're starting to see those.
So let's come back to what the president has said is the concern, though, which is stemming the tide of migrants coming to the border. Would this move have an impact on those numbers?
Well, not directly. The majority of migrants are not coming in through ports of entry. They are coming between the ports of entry. And so obviously shutting down the ports of entry would have it may even increase the amount of people coming between the ports of entry, because if migrants can no longer come through the ports, they would then try to come between the ports. So it wouldn't have an immediate impact or direct impact that way. But apparently, at least according to the president's tweets, that's not the intention anyway. The intention is to influence Mexico to do more, to either control its southern border or somehow prevent migrants from coming into the United States through its northern border. It's unclear exactly what the president believes Mexico should do, that it's not doing now, or what it wants him to do. But that is the direct implication, and possibly also, putting pressure on Congress to pass legislation that the administration has asked for that would allow it to, for example, detain families for longer than 20 days or return unaccompanied children to Central America faster. Provisions that Congress has previously declined to pass. So again, I think his intent is to put pressure on other players to do work to impact the migrants, but it would not have a direct impact on the migrants.
Yeah, and I think if you're talking about putting pressure on Mexico, look, Mexico has become a receiver of migrants, especially individuals seeking asylum. And this is a trend that's been accelerating since 2016 and definitely picked up in 2017 and 2018 under the last administration. So the idea that you're going to sort of push Mexico to adjust its policies that have been granting more humanitarian protection to the individuals coming in here overnight, I don't think is possible. I think the president has been looking at the Mexican government sort of taking a little bit, at least under the newest president, that the fact that the new president has really kind of been a little bit more open to bringing in immigrants on a more of a humanitarian basis. But like I said, this is a pattern and trend that's been happening for at least the last 2 years. So, if the president thinks he's going to just simply push the new Mexican government to sort of abandon having a more humanitarian position on managing immigration, that's just not going to happen. This is something that's been longstanding, something that we've already been seeing, and that's simply, I think, one of the challenges that he'll be coming across if he thinks he can use a border shutdown to push the Mexican government to accede to his demands.
Yeah, I would just add to that it's never a bad political play in Mexico to be seen as standing up to the big U.S. government. And so, yes, there may be economic impacts, but this president in particular, I think, is looking domestically at what is going to work for him. And the fact is that negotiating with this administration is not necessarily in his domestic interest. So we, again, have to see how this plays out.
So the other angle here that the president has said he wants to achieve with this threat of a border shutdown is to push Congress to take up immigration reform. So does this move or this threat create the leverage with Congress that he says or thinks it will?
Well, he said the similar thing about shutting down the government in December, and that didn't work out quite the way he wanted either. I think, part of it depends on what exactly he's asking for. If he's asking for just resources to support Border Patrol and CBP in addressing the migrants, they might, but they also gave them pretty substantial resources in the appropriations that they passed at the end of the shutdown. They're going to want to know, what did you do with that money and why do you need more now? I think in terms of the substantive policy issues that I mentioned, they have demanded several times over the authority to detain migrant families for longer and to return Central American migrant children. Those have not been considered in Congress, even when Republicans controlled both the House and the Senate. Those have not been able to be passed. Democrats in the House, I think, are going to be even more skeptical of adopting those particular changes. And there doesn't seem to be a bipartisan dialogue with the White House right now about what are other options that could be put on the table. That having been said, there's certainly something that has to be done. Congress is at the very least going to need to figure out if there's more resources that can be made available to CBP, who's the first agency to encounter these folks and is having difficulty with overcapacity at all of its facilities. It's trying to provide better care for those who are in its custody, but it's never been an agency that's held people for very longer than a few days or tried to. So this is definitely a shift. Overall, something is going to have to change, and we have to figure out what. I'd also say that the president the other day in a press conference in the White House threw out other immigration issues that he wanted to see dealt with, such as family migration. He called it chain migration and the visa lottery. I think adding anything else at this point is never going to happen. It's going to make it harder to get anything done. If he really wants to deal with the Central American migrant issue, it's going to have to be kept fairly narrow, and there has to be some sort of bipartisan dialogue about what's going to be acceptable across the aisle.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this before when the president wanted to sort of come to an agreement with Democrats on a DACA fix bill last year, when he started incorporating greater demands for restricting legal migration into the United States, particularly with family immigration, family sponsorship and based immigration, as well as the diversity visa. And that got him nowhere to be able to get closer to a deal for a DACA fix for funding for the border wall. So if he thinks that he's going to be using the same strategy here to sort of say, accede to my demands, I'm going to shut down the border, and then I want changes to the legal immigration system, I don't think that's just going to happen. We haven't seen that happen, or we haven't seen that work previously, and we're not going to see that work now.
All right, when we come back, cutting aid to the Northern Triangle. And we're back. In addition to threatening to shut down the U.S. Mexico border, President Trump took another step in recent weeks aimed at forcing control of migration. He directed the State Department to cut aid funding for 3 Central American countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. Trump is seeking to force those countries to stem their outward flows of migrants. But this move has come under intense criticism for potentially undermining efforts to target the root causes of that migration. So how did President Trump order the State Department to carry out this decision to cut aid to those 3 countries? And what do we know about whether state had advance notice of this decision?
Well, the money that was appropriated last year has been at State Department and awaiting disbursement to those countries for several months. There's been reporting that the State Department officials were sort of holding on to that because there had been talk within the White House that the president might want to turn down aid, but it wasn't clear that there was an actual decision to do so. The president then did what he usually does, which is issue a tweet saying, I am stopping all aid to Mexico. That was made clear, I guess, to the State Department that this is a direct order from the president, and so they have therefore notified all the players in the region that they will not be dispersing those funds this year, and apparently notified Congress as well. In terms of policy making, it's, I guess, typical for this administration to come from a presidential tweet. It's not the normal round of policy making, but that's where we stand right now.
So there's a conception out there that this type of aid is simple cash payments to foreign countries with no strings attached, but I understand that is not the case. So how has this funding been used in the Northern Triangle, and what kind of efforts does it support?
Well, I think the false impression is that this money goes to the governments of those countries. Most of it does not go directly to the governments of those countries. In fact, it has been the policy of U.S. AID, which is the agency within the State Department that disperses funds, to work primarily with non-governmental organizations in the country, to work directly with local communities and civic leaders, to try to impact such conditions literally granularly on the ground and in communities that are most affected. They tend to work with programs that have shown impacts and that can have demonstrated success, and they try to, as I said, direct the aid to where it can do the most good in changing conditions on the ground in those countries. The fact is that the governments themselves usually are not the first players that the U.S. government works with, because if you think about it, the inability of the government to address the conditions on the ground is part of why people are leaving and why the country needs aid. So it makes most sense to try to see what you can do to address those conditions before you engage with the governments.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that there's also the National Endowment for Democracy that promotes rule of law programs, and NED works in the same way. That provides funding directly to organizations, civil society groups that are operating in these Northern Triangle countries. They receive the funding, then they implement it, and then they go forward with it. So there's sort of a chain of both the aid that's being distributed to the organizations that distribute the funding as subcontractors, that's then put to the individuals who are implementing it, and then they're monitored and evaluated. So there's a whole string of ways that the aid reaches these countries and then is evaluated. But I think when the president is sort of thinking about how he's going to cut aid, he kind of is coming from a background of basically his background is real estate deals where it's a one-to-one negotiation, and I think that's the way he's sort of thinking about cutting aid. Is he's thinking, I'll pressure this individual leader in this country to do that, when in fact it's the levers just simply don't exist that way with aid.
Yeah, I mean, he thinks of it definitely in a transactional way, and this is a little bit more complicated how aid is dispersed in those countries. As a matter of fact, in past years, Congress has insisted that the aid also be contingent on the government's implementing some anti-corruption measures and things like that. So there has been a little bit of pressure put on the governments to, continue the flow to these, NGOs and other ground agencies. Most of the governments want this aid. They want these programs. They do, want to try to see if they can prevent their people from, migrating out. But again, it's not a direct one-to-one transaction in the way I think the president has looked at it.
So you both have written extensively on how vital this funding is to addressing the regional migration crisis. Why?
Basically, this funding addresses one of the core issues or one of the core drivers of immigration to Mexico and as well as the United States, which is really addressing corruption and issues with governance, with economic development, the lack of economic opportunities, and promoting human security. That means not only being safe from, say, gangs that are operating in the area, but also just providing, medicine and schooling, a whole host of things. So when you look at all the different programs that are being funded by the United States in these countries, and the possibility that these programs are going to face shortages, those are services or initiatives that these programs won't have the funding to carry that out, to address the root causes. Once again, it's a complex issue. That's not the root causes of these migratory flows isn't only just linked directly to what's happening in these countries. That's one factor, but it's probably one of the dominant factors, and this is why this is really disconcerting.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is that we do have to understand that this kind of development assistance and development in general is not a short-term play. It's hard to say that it's one-on-one directly. That if we put so many dollars into a country, we see reduced migration. You can't necessarily make that correlation. But as Cris said, this is about addressing the factors that cause people to want to migrate, or that pushes them, the so-called push factors. And again, what we have seen is over time, where countries have sort of used the aid to develop, we have seen reductions in migration on a longer term. So probably the most successful one we can talk about is Plan Colombia, where over a period of a decade and a half, governance there, safety and security there have changed, and fewer people are coming. Mexico also has developed a lot. It has also had a demographic change, so there are less young people going into the labor market for the jobs they have. So there's more opportunity for people to stay there and earn a living rather than come to the United States, and migration from Mexico has dropped. So there's a lot of things that have to go together to affect those push factors. And again, there are pull factors from the United States, and the fact that a lot of these people have family members here or people they know here. There's extensive diasporas that sort of say, hey, there's great opportunity to come here. We can't discount that. We don't always know how big a part of the migration decision the push and the pull factors make. But the fact of the matter is, I think most people would say you need to address both, that just doing one side or the other is not going to wholly address the issues.
So let's be clear, though. The president has made this decision, but Congress directs how the government spends its money. So can Congress overrule this decision, or is the president's word the final one on this issue?
Well, that is a really good question. Certainly, Congress has said this is money that we are giving you, and you are required to spend it in a certain way. The administration has written back to Congress saying, nope, for these reasons, a policy or whatever, we are not going to spend this money. And the ball is kind of in Congress's court now, what they're going to do. They can sort of take it out on the administration in the next appropriations round and say, well, we're going to order you to spend this money, and if you don't spend this money, we will take money from these other programs you want or from the White House itself. Congress has done that in the past. But realistically, in the short run, Congress could take the president to court and say, you don't have the authority to do that. That would be a long, drawn-out process that wouldn't address it in the short term. This is a conundrum that the United States is going through right now. When the president pushes norms and agreements with Congress that have been standard for, a long time in this country, what are the avenues, what are the levers that Congress has available to it to enforce its prerogatives under the Constitution? We haven't seen Congress really do a lot in the first couple of years of this presidency. We know that there certainly will be oversight and hearings from the Democrats in the House at least, but fundamentally, can they overrule this decision? That's a little unclear. We'll have to see what happens.
Yeah, the only other thing I would be paying attention to as well is the members of Congress that work on international relations issues and the extent to which they will see this decision as impacting the relationship the United States has with these governments and with the region in general, and whether or not they'll sort of be taking this decision and saying we can't stand for this. We actually need to continue engaging with our partners. Now, the way that they would pressure the administration, obviously, one is funding, but the other one might be hearings or making public statements or circumventing the administration and meeting directly with leaders from these countries. So that's the other, I think, the more political component, but there's always the appropriations discussions that I think are central to this debate.
All right, on the other side of a break, has Customs and Border Protection reached its breaking point? Finally today, starting about 2 weeks ago, media outlets began publishing some upsetting photos and stories of a Customs and Border Protection camp of migrants held under a bridge in El Paso, Texas. CBP has also been sharing these images as evidence of the scale of the border crisis. Although these images and stories generated controversy about the treatment of migrants by CBP, they're also sparking discussion about how the flow of migrants has pushed the agency's detention capacity to the brink in recent weeks, as CBP detains larger groups of people seeking asylum. Theresa, the story about this shelter under a bridge in El Paso has touched on so many issues at the heart of the ongoing debate about border security and control, specifically whether CBP has the ability to hold a quickly growing number of migrants arriving at the border, whether it should seek to detain them, and whether the immigration and asylum systems are being strained beyond their capacity. How dire is the situation for CBP right now?
I would say that, immediately right now, CBP is overwhelmed. The facilities that it has at the border to, even for a very short time, hold and process migrants are well over capacity. That includes ports of entry and border patrol stations, in part because the migrants are coming by the hundreds at a time. And you have to put this in relative scale to sort of what we traditionally have seen along the U.S. Mexico border. Traditionally, since we've been enforcing our laws at the U.S. Mexico border, the vast majority of people apprehended, one, were trying to evade detection. They were apprehended in ones or twos or small groups. A big group might be considered 20 or 30. Most of them were Mexican. Most of them were adult males. And most of them, frankly, could be processed and returned from the CBP facilities within 24 hours, 48 hours, 72 hours at the very longest. And that wasn't a capacity issue. Usually had to do with other agencies or other documents and things that had to be done. What we're seeing now, again, is the majority of those arriving are not Mexican. They are family members with often tender-age children, as small as infants. They are coming, as I said, by hundreds at a time, up to 1,000 a day in certain areas, for facilities that were meant to hold maybe 100 people, maybe 150 people, in circumstances that, first of all, are not and were not designed to hold families and young children at all. They look very much like your local police station, a booking center holding cells that are very jail-like. They are not a place for families or kids. And so CBP is, at the moment, just running out of places to house people, to hold them, even for the length of time that it might take to process them. Other actors in the immigration system that would usually take them from CBP if they could not return them immediately, such as Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and for unaccompanied children, Health and Human Services, are also reporting capacity issues. So, if they're not taking them from CBP custody, then CBP, is the place where everything backs up. Certainly, having migrants wait under a bridge outdoors in a chain link fence area on gravel is not ideal from anybody's point of view. I think CBP would also acknowledge that they didn't want to do that, but they are kind of out of options at the moment. Absent just literally releasing people into the country without doing anything whatsoever, which is not in their mandate. So there is a system-wide crisis, if you want to put it that way. There are lots of reasons why the crisis exists now, and a lot of people are arguing about that. Could the administration have changed its policies earlier to address this? Could there have been more resources applied earlier? That, all of which is probably true, but where we are right now is going to require some immediate extreme actions, and that's what you're seeing CBP try to do with pulling people from the ports of entry, looking at additional temporary facilities or processing centers that can handle capacity. But we are now at the point, I think, of calling this a crisis for them.
Yeah, I think what we've sort of been having an academic debate here in Washington about whether or not we're seeing historic low levels of apprehensions compared to prior eras. And I think at this point that debate now is rendered moot because yes, overall numbers of apprehensions are quote unquote low, but the dramatic shift in the population, it's sort of this dramatic shift hitting up against an infrastructure that was never designed for that. That's the key issue, I think, more than anything else, because sure, absolute numbers, if there were higher levels, that would have been an issue. But the fact is, like as Theresa said, that we had a system designed with the assumption of what immigration has looked like, basically from the 1980s to the 1990s. That's like really the base assumption of what we base our border system on. It was inevitably going to fail if you saw a dramatic shift in the populations, and that's where we are now. But once again, kind of seeking to blame individuals, I think, is besides the point. We just need to deal with the issue as it is right now.
Is this a problem that we're seeing just in urban areas, or is it widespread across the border, or is it localized in some other way?
It started, I think we saw the heavy volumes initially in the Rio Grande Valley, South Texas, Laredo to Brownsville. And then now it's showing up in El Paso. We had the incidences of the busloads of people arriving in southern New Mexico at some of the remotest ports of entry and remotest places along the U.S. Mexico border where these facilities are even smaller and arriving by the hundreds. We are seeing it also in Arizona. It's increasing in Tijuana. This is sort of the new normal in some ways. It certainly is the new modus operandi for the smuggling organizations to bring the families to the border in large numbers, literally in busloads, and then escort them to the border and say either, you can go under this fence or over this fence, or we'll raft you across the river and then go find somebody. And they're doing it by hundreds at a time. And this is essentially, for right now, the new normal way. And it is, as I said, abnormal historically in terms of how CBP encountered migrants, but also a capacity issue for them at all across the border right now.
Yeah, and I think the key thing is that when you're looking also at CBP's capacities, obviously there are facilities that are in more remote regions Those are actually probably smaller facilities, once again, built on the assumption that fewer people are going to go through there. But then, so you have these smaller facilities in remote areas. More people are showing up to these remote areas in greater numbers. And once again, you're seeing this repeat of the situation of having resources that are just, or numbers are arriving in such large numbers that are disproportionate to the capacity of CBP to receive them. So this urban-rural divide, I think it only shows how dire the situation is and how the further away it's located from an urban area, the more the situation is exacerbated.
As you said, this is kind of the new normal, and this regional migration crisis shows no signs of slowing. So how can we better address these issues related to CBP's ability to hold and process migrants arriving at the U.S. Mexico border? What do we need to do to have the capacity to handle this influx of people in a better way?
So I think we need to think of it in terms of what can we do on an emergency basis immediately to deal with CBP receiving families and children, the issues that are accompanying to that, the humanitarian issues, the space issues. We need to think then seriously about what can we do to address this continued flow, the smuggling operations, and change it so that it's more manageable. We have to also think about what can be done to sort of change the flow. The smugglers bringing people in by the hundreds and smuggling the families. This probably is going to require working with Mexico and the Central American countries on some sort of regional options, some of which may require legislative change. Then there's the process of what we do with families and children after they arrive. So then we need to think about, our asylum process as it is designed was really not designed with this volume in mind. And maybe we need to think about, the capacity of other parts of our asylum system, especially immigration courts, which is where all of these cases end up. And that 3-year wait for an asylum case in immigration court is one of the major challenges that's driving a lot of this. So I think we're going to have to obviously think emergency-wise now, like maybe a response like we would have to a natural disaster, mobilize people, mobilize resources, mobilize facilities. It may not be pretty in the short term, but we really have to figure out what we do on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sometimes, in the U.S., we don't take pages from how other countries have dealt with this, but Mexico, and their asylum system is being flooded by a large number of individuals arriving, work with the UNHCR to kind of have UNHCR staff boost up their capacity by having more staff, having more individuals who can process asylum on behalf of their asylum agency, having UNHCR help with set up housing. So the thing is, in the United States, it's not that we need UNHCR to come here, but the idea of boosting capacity in the short term in really core targeted ways, like Theresa has been talking about, I think is a short term idea that could definitely work. Congress did, in the DHS appropriations bill that they passed last month, allocated funding for humanitarian purposes for CBP. So obviously, in the midterm, obviously what will happen with the next round of discussions for appropriations, if they continue that trend, that's another good way of taking positive steps. But the problem is the problem is immediate. It is now. And we just need to be able to boost CBP's capacity in the quickest way possible without, once again, having this whole debate of, could we have foreseen this? That doesn't matter. Do we have high numbers of individuals? That doesn't matter. There's a crisis, and then we need an immediate solution to that.
Theresa, Cris, thanks for joining me, and thanks to you all for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, please take a second to find us on Facebook by searching Bipartisan Policy Center or on Twitter at BPC_bipartisan. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your feedback on this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Bipartisan Policy Center. This episode of This Week in Immigration was written by Chris, Ramón, and myself, and produced by Ashley Swearingen. That's all for now. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.